The morning of June 22, 1941, dawned bright and clear over the Soviet airfield at Stanislav. Staff Sergeant Mikhail Petrovich Devyatayev stood outside the Photo Reconnaissance Unit headquarters, camera in hand, squinting into the early sun. He was 20 years old, thin as a rail, with hands that trembled slightly whenever he held anything more dangerous than a shutter release. The brass had been clear about his assignment: document aircraft, capture training exercises, stay behind the lines. His job was to preserve history, not make it. He had no way of knowing that within 3 years he would become history itself. The first bombs fell at 4:15 in the morning. Devyatayev was in the darkroom, developing photographs of a new Yak-1 fighter that had arrived the previous day. The building shook. Chemical trays sloshed over, ruining hours of work. Through the red-lit darkness, he heard the thunder of explosions, the screaming of engines, the staccato hammering of machine guns. Operation Barbarossa had begun. When he stumbled outside, the world was on fire. German Messerschmitts swept across the airfield in waves, their guns spitting death. Soviet planes, lined up in neat rows as if for parade inspection, exploded one after another. Men ran in every direction, some toward their aircraft, most away from them. The carefully organized Soviet Air Force was being annihilated on the ground, and Devyatayev stood there with his camera, capturing the apocalypse one frame at a time, but something inside him refused to accept this role. Something primal and furious. A pilot stumbled past him, blood streaming from a head wound. The man collapsed near a Polikarpov Mi-16 fighter, one of the few planes not yet burning. Devyatayev ran to him, tried to help him up, but the pilot grabbed his collar with desperate strength. "Can you fly?" the pilot gasped. "I'm a photographer," Devyatayev said. "Can you fly?" Devyatayev had 37 hours of unofficial flight time, stolen moments when sympathetic pilots let him take the controls during photo reconnaissance missions. He'd never soloed, never fired a gun, never done anything but observe. "Yes," he heard himself say. The pilot pressed something into his hand. "Dog tags." "Tell my wife," he whispered, and then his eyes went distant and empty. Devyatayev ran to the I-16. The engine was still warm. His hands moved over the controls with a certainty he didn't feel. Throttle forward. "Stick back." The little fighter lurched into the air just as a bomb crater opened where it had been parked. He was 30 feet off the ground when he saw the Messerschmitt. It came at him head-on, guns already flashing. Devyatayev did the only thing his panicked brain could conceive. He yanked the stick hard right and squeezed the trigger. He didn't aim. He didn't lead the target. He just fired wildly and prayed. The Messerschmitt exploded. For a moment, Devyatayev thought he'd imagined it. Photographers didn't shoot down German fighters. Photographers didn't do anything but watch. But there was the wreckage spinning earthward in a spiral of black smoke and orange flame. He'd killed a man, actually killed someone. He vomited in the cockpit, then wiped his mouth and turned back toward the swarm of enemy aircraft destroying his airfield. The battle lasted 17 minutes. When it was over, 43 Soviet aircraft lay burning on the ground. Devyatayev had shot down 3 Messerschmitts and damaged 2 more. He landed the I-16 with a shaking hand, the gear coming down crooked, the approach sloppy and dangerous. When he climbed out, his commanding officer was waiting. Major Sokolov stared at him for a long moment. "You were ordered to photograph aircraft, Sergeant, not fly them." "Yes, sir." "You violated direct orders." "Yes, sir." Sokolov's stern expression cracked. "Well done, you crazy bastard. Report to fighter training immediately." That was how Mikhail Devyatayev stopped being a photographer and became a fighter pilot. But this is only the beginning of his story. The real nightmare was still to come. By the spring of 1943, Devyatayev was no longer the trembling boy with a camera. He was a predator. His I-16 had been replaced by a Yak-9, a sleek, deadly machine that responded to his thoughts as much as his hands. He flew with the 104th Fighter Aviation Regiment, and his personal tally stood at 9 confirmed kills. But the war was grinding the Soviet Union into dust. For every victory, there were a dozen defeats. For every German plane shot down, 10 more appeared. The Luftwaffe seemed endless, unstoppable. On July 13, 1943, Devyatayev's squadron was scrambled to intercept German bombers attacking Soviet positions near Orel. Intelligence reported a small formation, maybe 8 aircraft. Easy work, They flew into a trap. 40 German fighters fell on them from the sun, Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, piloted by men with hundreds of hours of combat experience. Deviatayev's squadron was torn apart in minutes. He saw his wingman, a kid from Kiev who'd just turned 19, explode in a ball of fire, saw another friend spiral down with his canopy shot away, screaming all the way to the ground. Deviatayev fought like a demon. He shot down 2 fighters, damaged a third. But there were too many. A Focke-Wulf got behind him and stayed there, bullets chewing through his tail section. His controls went sloppy, oil pressure dropping, coolant temperature rising. He was 30 kilometers behind enemy lines when the engine seized. The silence was absolute. No roar of the engine. No whistle of wind. Just the quiet creaking of the airframe as he glided lower and lower over German-occupied territory. He could see soldiers looking up at him, pointing. Could see trucks moving to intercept his landing site. He crashed in a forest, the impact slamming his head against the gun sight. Blood filled his mouth. His left arm hung useless, broken in at least 2 places. Through the shattered canopy, he saw German soldiers running toward him. He reached for his sidearm, thinking he'd take a few with him. But his holster was empty, torn away in the crash. The last thing he saw before losing consciousness was the barrel of a German rifle pointing at his face. Deviatayev woke in hell. The POW camp near Lodz was a place where men went to die slowly. Starvation, disease, execution. The Germans offered a variety of ways to leave the world. Soviet pilots were treated with particular cruelty. Stalin had declared that any soldier who surrendered was a traitor, which meant that even if you somehow survived and made it home, you'd be shot by your own side. Deviatayev spent 7 months in Lodz. He watched good men waste away to skeletons, watched them die of typhus, of dysentery, of simple despair. He watched executions every morning, the crack of rifles as regular as a church bell. But he refused to die. He stole food from the guards' garbage, did whatever work they demanded, no matter how degrading, memorized the camp routine, the guard shifts, the weak points in the wire. And he planned. 3 times he tried to escape. 3 times he was caught and beaten within an inch of his life. After the 3rd attempt, the commandant had him transferred to Peenemünde. If Lodz was hell, Peenemünde was the devil's workshop. The camp sat on the Baltic coast, on the island of Usedom. It was small, only about 100 prisoners, all selected for technical skills. They worked in a massive factory complex where the Germans were building something new, something terrible, rockets, missiles that could fly hundreds of miles and obliterate entire city blocks. The V2 program. Deviatayev was assigned to construction detail, hauling equipment, pouring concrete, doing the mindless labor that kept the death factory running. But he watched everything. His photographer's eye, trained to capture details, observed and catalogued. He saw the rockets on their launch pads, heard the engineers discussing trajectories and payloads. He understood with growing horror that these weapons could change the war, could rain destruction on Moscow, on London, on any target the Germans chose. And he realized something else. Next to the military rockets, the Germans kept a small fleet of training aircraft. Heinkel He-111 bombers, used for navigation training and cargo transport. They sat on a small auxiliary airfield, guarded but not heavily. The photographer in him wanted to document this to preserve the evidence. But the pilot in him saw something different. An opportunity. February 8, 1945. The war was turning against Germany, but in Peenemünde the work continued with desperate urgency. Hitler demanded his wonder weapons, and the engineers worked 20-hour days to give them to him. Deviatayev had been in the camp for 9 months. He'd lost 40 pounds. 3 of his teeth had fallen out from scurvy. He had scars across his back from beatings, and his right hand trembled constantly from nerve damage. But his eyes still worked. His mind still worked. He'd identified 9 other prisoners who he thought might be brave enough or crazy enough to try what he was planning. All Russians, all military men, all facing the same choice, risk everything or wait for the bullet. They met in whispers in the few moments of privacy the camp allowed. Deviatayev outlined his plan. It was insane, suicidal. It had 100 ways to fail and maybe 1 way to succeed. "We steal a plane," he said simply. The others stared at him. The Heinkel on the north field. "I've watched the guards. There's a 10-minute gap in their patrol between 13 and 13:10. The plane is usually fueled because they use it for short observation flights. We take it, we fly west over the Baltic, then turn south. If we're lucky, we reach Soviet lines before the fighters catch us. And if we're not lucky? Someone asked. Devyatayev smiled, a death's head grimace. Then we die free men instead of slaves. They planned for 3 weeks, studied the guard patterns, memorized the layout of the airfield. Devyatayev made a crude map from memory, sketching it in the dirt and then destroying it each night. On February 8th, everything came together. The day was overcast, visibility poor, perfect for escape. The prisoners on the work detail were assigned to clear snow from a roadway that ran near the auxiliary airfield. At 12:55, Devyatayev gave the signal. They moved as one, 10 men, running across open ground toward the Heinkel sitting on the hardstand. Guards shouted. An alarm siren began to wail. Rifles fired. 2 men fell. 8 kept running. Devyatayev reached the Heinkel first. The crew door was unlocked, God bless German efficiency. He hauled himself into the cockpit, the others piling in behind him. A mechanic appeared, wrench in hand, confusion on his face. One of the prisoners hit him with a stolen shovel. The controls were different from the Soviet fighters Devyatayev had flown. The cockpit was larger, the instruments labeled in German. But the basics were the same. Throttles, mixture controls, magnetos. He ran through the startup sequence from memory, praying he had it right. The first engine coughed, then caught. The second followed. The bomber trembled, alive. Bullets pinged off the fuselage. Through the windscreen, Devyatayev saw German soldiers running toward them, an entire platoon mobilizing. A Kubelwagen raced across the tarmac, machine gun mounted in the back. "Hold on," Devyatayev shouted, and shoved the throttles forward. The Heinkel lurched ahead, picking up speed. Too slow, far too slow. The bomber was heavy, sluggish. The machine gun in the Kubelwagen opened fire, stitching holes across the wing. Someone in the back screamed. The end of the runway rushed toward them. Devyatayev hauled back on the yoke. The Heinkel lifted, settled, lifted again. The wheels kissed the ground once more, then left it for good. They were airborne. Behind them, Peenemünde fell away. The rocket facilities, the death camp, the guards and guns and wire, all of it shrinking into the distance. But they weren't safe yet. The flight should have taken 90 minutes. It took 4 hours. German fighters scrambled within minutes of their escape. 2 Messerschmitts caught them over the Baltic, guns blazing. Devyatayev threw the Heinkel into a dive, pushing the bomber to its limits. The fighters overshot, circled back. One of the Russians found a machine gun in the aft compartment and fired back. Wild bursts that did nothing but make noise. They flew so low that the propellers kicked up spray from the waves. One engine was trailing smoke. The compass had been damaged in the strafing run, or maybe it was never working in the first place. Devyatayev flew by sun position and instinct, heading south, always south. A Focke-Wulf found them near the coast. Its first pass killed 3 men instantly, the cannon shells tearing through the thin aluminum skin of the bomber. The second pass jammed the rudder, leaving Devyatayev wrestling with a plane that wanted to fly in circles. Then Soviet airspace. Then Soviet fighters Yaks and Lavochkins rising to intercept what they thought was a German bomber. Devyatayev waggled his wings frantically, the universal signal for distress. The Soviet fighters held their fire, but they didn't escort him either. They just watched, suspicious. He crash-landed in a field near Belly, 50 kilometers west of Moscow. The landing gear collapsed. The left wing tore off. The fuselage skidded 300 meters through frozen mud before coming to rest against a stone wall. 5 men climbed out alive. 5 out of 10. Soviet soldiers surrounded them within minutes, rifles raised. An officer approached, looked them over. The emaciated prisoners in German camp clothing climbing out of a German bomber. "You're under arrest," the officer said. "Suspected collaboration with the enemy." Devyatayev laughed. He couldn't help it. They'd escaped a death camp, stolen an enemy plane, flown through German fighter patrols and survived a crash landing. And now their own side was arresting them, of course, he said. "Of course you are." They spent 3 months in an NKVD prison while Soviet intelligence tried to decide if they were heroes or traitors. Stalin's paranoia meant that anyone who'd been captured was automatically suspect. POWs who escaped were even more suspicious. Why had the Germans let them live? What information had they traded for their survival? Devyatayev told his story 100 times, described Peenemünde in minute detail, the rocket program, the V-2 launchers, the production schedules. His photographer's memory proved useful after all. Soviet intelligence cross-referenced his information with other sources and finally concluded he was telling the truth. On to her. May 15, 1945, a week after Germany surrendered, they released him. There was no fanfare, no medal, no recognition, just a terse notification that he was free to go, and a train ticket back to his family in the Mordovian countryside. Devyatayev found work as a teacher. He married a local girl, had children, lived a quiet life. He never flew again. Never spoke about the war unless pressed. The government had classified everything about his escape. Peenemünde was too sensitive. The rocket program too valuable now that the Soviets were reverse engineering captured V-2s. For 20 years, Mikhail Devyatayev was a forgotten man. But history doesn't forget its heroes forever. In 1957, a Soviet researcher was compiling a report on German rocket development when he came across a strange footnote in captured documents. A security incident at Peenemünde in February 1945. A stolen aircraft. Escaped prisoners who'd somehow flown to safety. The researcher dug deeper. Found Soviet intelligence reports from the same period. Found interviews with the survivors, including one Mikhail Petrovich Devyatayev, currently teaching mathematics at a school in Mordovia. The researcher brought his findings to higher authorities. Someone brought them to Khrushchev. On August 15, 1957, Mikhail Devyatayev was summoned to Moscow. He went reluctantly, assuming it was some new interrogation, some reopening of old suspicions. Instead, he was taken to the Kremlin. Khrushchev himself pinned the medal on his chest. Hero of the Soviet Union, the nation's highest honor. We should have done this 12 years ago, Khrushchev said. Better late than never. The official citation noted that Devyatayev's intelligence about Peenemünde had been crucial to Soviet rocket development, that his escape had provided vital information about German weapons programs, that his bravery had served the motherland even when the motherland had doubted him, but the citation didn't mention the most important thing. It didn't mention that Mikhail Devyatayev had been ordered to just take photos, and instead he'd fought, that he'd been ordered to stay behind the lines and instead he'd flown into combat, that he'd been ordered to die quietly in a prison camp, and instead he'd stolen an enemy plane and flown it home. The citation didn't mention that sometimes history is made by people who refuse to follow orders. In the years after his recognition, Devyatayev became a Soviet celebrity. He gave speeches to schoolchildren, attended military ceremonies, met with cosmonauts, the new heroes of the Soviet Union, heirs to the pilots who'd fought in the Great Patriotic War. But he remained at heart the same man who'd stood on that airfield in 1941 with a camera in his hand, watching the world burn. I never wanted to be a fighter pilot, he told an interviewer in 1963. I wanted to be a photographer, to capture moments, preserve them, show people what war really looked like. But war doesn't care what you want. It makes you into what it needs. The interviewer asked him about the 40 planes he'd destroyed in his career, the 3 on that first chaotic morning in 1941, the 37 more in the following 2 years of combat. The German records and Soviet records matched. 40 confirmed kills, an ace 10 times over. I don't think about the planes, Devyatayev said. I think about the pilots. 40 men who died because I was good at my job. 40 men who had families, who had dreams, who wanted to go home. I killed them because that's what war demanded. But I remember every single one. He paused, looking out the window at the Moscow skyline. That's the difference between a soldier and a murderer, I suppose. A soldier remembers. Mikhail Petrovich Devyatayev lived until November 24, 2002. He was 81 years old. He died peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by children and grandchildren who knew him not as a war hero, but as a gentle old man who taught them to appreciate beauty, to capture moments with cameras and preserve them for the future. His funeral was attended by veterans of the Great Patriotic War, by politicians and generals, by cosmonauts and historians. They buried him with full military honors, his medals gleaming on his chest, his Hero of the Soviet Union star catching the winter sunlight. But perhaps the most fitting tribute came from a place he'd never expected. In Peenemünde, now part of reunified Germany, the Historical Museum includes an exhibit about the camp and the forced labor that built the V-2 rockets. There's a small section dedicated to the escape of February 8, 1945. It includes photographs of the Heinkel bomber, diagrams of the flight path, and a brief biography of Deviatayev. At the bottom of the exhibit, there's a quote from Wernher von Braun, the chief architect of the V-2 program, who went on to lead the American space program. He was interviewed about Peenemünde in 1969, just after the Apollo moon landing. The interviewer asked him about the escape, about how 10 prisoners had managed to steal a plane from under the noses of German security, about how a Soviet fighter pilot had outsmarted the entire Wehrmacht. Von Braun smiled. In war, he said, we often forget that courage doesn't respect nationality. Deviatayev was a brave man, a clever man. If he'd been born in Germany, we would have made him a general. Since he was born in Russia, we made him a problem. But respect is respect regardless of the uniform. It was the closest thing to an apology the prisoners of Peenemünde would ever receive. Today, the story of Mikhail Deviatayev is taught in Russian schools. Fighter pilots study his tactics. Historians debate the exact details of his escape. A movie was made about his life in 2021, dramatizing his story for a new generation. But the real story isn't about the planes he destroyed or the medals he earned. It's about a choice. On that morning in June 1941, when the bombs started falling and the world caught fire, Mikhail Deviatayev stood with a camera in his hand. He could have run, could have hidden, could have done exactly what he was ordered to do: observe, document, survive. Instead, he chose to fight. It's a choice that millions of people made during World War II. The choice to stand instead of run, to fight instead of hide, to be more than what circumstances demanded, to become what the moment required. Some of those people were remembered. Most were forgotten, but every single one of them, in their own way, helped turn the tide of the greatest conflict in human history. Mikhail Deviatayev was ordered to just take photos. Thank God he disobeyed. The photographer who became a fighter pilot. The prisoner who became an escape artist. The forgotten hero who became a legend. This is his story. This is the story of everyone who refused to accept the role they were given, and instead wrote their own chapter in history. This is the story of World War II, told not in grand strategies and political maneuvers, but in the single moment when one man decided that taking pictures wasn't enough. When he decided that some moments don't need to be captured, they need to be changed. And Mikhail Petrovich Deviatayev changed everything.